The frozen concrete felt like ice against my bare knuckles as I crawled deeper into the storm drain, my breath forming white clouds in the bitter December air. Behind me, the world above was celebrating Christmas Eve, warm lights twinkling through frosted windows while families gathered around dinner tables. But down here, in this forgotten tunnel beneath the city, I heard something that would change my life forever. A whimper, weak, desperate, almost human. I'd love to know. What time is it where you are right now, and which city or state are you watching from? My name is Marcus, and 3 years ago, I was just another face in the crowd of forgotten souls living on the streets of Chicago. The kind of man people cross the street to avoid, clutching their purses a little tighter when they see my weathered coat and untrimmed beard. But what they didn't know, what nobody could see beneath the layers of grime and exhaustion, was that I still had a heart that could break. It had been breaking for months. I'd been homeless since losing my job at the steel mill, then my apartment, then my dignity piece by piece like breadcrumbs scattered for pigeons. The streets had hardened me in ways I never thought possible. You learn to shut off the part of yourself that feels too much, because feeling too much on the streets means drowning in a sea of hopelessness that never ends. But animals were different. Every stray cat I shared my meager scraps with, every injured bird I gently moved from the sidewalk, they reminded me that kindness still existed somewhere inside my chest. It was the one part of myself I refused to let the cold streets steal away. That's how I ended up in the storm drain that night, following a sound that most people would have ignored. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees below zero, and the wind cut through the city like broken glass. I'd been walking for hours, looking for somewhere warm to spend Christmas Eve, when I heard it again, that whimper, echoing up from the metal grate near the old industrial district. I knelt down on the frozen sidewalk, my joints creaking like old hinges, and peered through the grate. The darkness below was complete, but the sound was clearer now. It wasn't just whimpering. It was crying, raw, desperate, the kind of sound that comes from a soul that's given up hope. Most people would have kept walking, called animal control maybe, if they were feeling generous. But animal control doesn't work on Christmas Eve. And I knew what it felt like to cry alone in the dark with no one listening. I pried the grate open with my bare hands, the metal so cold it burned my fingers. The opening was barely wide enough for my shoulders, but I'd lost enough weight living on the streets that I could squeeze through. I dropped down into the tunnel, landing hard on the concrete floor. The smell hit me first. Sewage, rust, and something else. Something that made my stomach turn. Fear. Pain. The smell of an animal that had been suffering for a long time. I pulled out my phone, using its weak flashlight to illuminate the tunnel ahead. The battery was almost dead, like always, but it gave me just enough light to see the horror waiting in the darkness. 20 feet ahead, where the tunnel narrowed into a maintenance pipe, I saw him. A German shepherd, massive even in his weakened state, was trapped inside a concrete pipe that was far too small for his body. His head and front paws were visible, but the rest of him was wedged tight inside the frozen concrete tube. His eyes, when they caught the light from my phone, were wells of pure desperation. He'd been trying to crawl through the pipe, probably seeking shelter from the cold, and had gotten stuck. The concrete was old and cracked, with jagged edges that had torn into his beautiful coat. Dark stains around the opening told me he'd been bleeding, but it was his eyes that broke me. They held the same look I'd seen in my own reflection every morning for the past year. The look of someone who had been abandoned by the world, who had given up on the possibility that anyone would care if they lived or died. I approached slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. He didn't growl or try to bite. He just watched me with those ancient, tired eyes and let out another whimper that seemed to echo from the depths of his soul. When I reached him, I could see the full extent of his situation. The pipe was part of an old drainage system, and the concrete had narrowed over the years as sediment and ice built up inside. He was trapped so tightly that he couldn't move forward or backward. His hind legs were scraped raw from trying to push himself out, and his breathing was shallow and labored. How long had he been here? Hours? Days? I reached out slowly and touched his head. His fur was matted with ice and dirt, but beneath it, I could feel the strong skull of a proud animal. He leaned into my touch with a small whine, and I felt something crack open inside my chest. This dog was dying. Slowly, painfully, alone in the dark. Just like I had been dying, inch by inch, on the streets above. But unlike me, he couldn't give up. He couldn't just stop trying. Some part of him was still fighting, still hoping that someone would find him. Someone had found him. I sat back on my heels and studied the situation. The pipe was too narrow for him to back out, and too long for me to pull him through from the front. The concrete was thick and solid, worn smooth by decades of water flow. I didn't have tools, didn't have help, didn't have anything except my bare hands and a phone with 5% battery life. But I had something else. Something the streets hadn't managed to kill yet. I had stubborn, stupid hope. I started by trying to dig around the pipe opening with my fingers, hoping to widen it enough for him to squeeze back out. The concrete was like stone, and within minutes my fingertips were raw and bleeding. The cold made every scrape feel like fire, but I kept digging. The dog watched me work, his eyes never leaving my face. Sometimes he would try to help, scrabbling weakly with his front paws, but he was too exhausted and cramped to do much. I could hear his stomach rumbling with hunger, could see the ribs showing through his matted coat. When had he last eaten? When had he last felt a kind touch? After an hour of digging, I'd managed to chip away maybe an inch of concrete. At this rate, it would take days to free him, and he didn't have days. His breathing was getting shallower, his eyes starting to glaze with exhaustion. I sat back against the tunnel wall and tried to think. My phone was dead now, leaving us in complete darkness except for the faint light filtering down through the grate 20 feet away. The silence was broken only by our breathing and the occasional drip of water from somewhere deeper in the tunnel. That's when I heard the voices above. Footsteps on the sidewalk, people talking and laughing as they walked past. Normal people with normal lives, heading home to normal families and warm houses. I could call out, ask for help, but would they listen? Would they care about a homeless man and a trapped dog in a storm drain on Christmas Eve? I thought about my own family, scattered to the winds years ago. My ex-wife, who'd stopped returning my calls when the drinking got bad. My daughter, who was probably opening presents right now with her stepfather. The successful man who'd replaced me in her life without breaking stride. When was the last time anyone had worried about where I was spending Christmas? But this dog, this beautiful, broken animal, was looking at me like I was his whole world. Like I was the answer to prayers he'd been whispering in the dark for who knows how long. I made a decision. I stripped off my heavy winter coat, the one I'd gotten from the shelter last month. It was the warmest thing I owned, my protection against the brutal Chicago winter. I bundled it up and pushed it against the opening of the pipe, creating a cushion between the sharp concrete edges and the dog's body. Then I started digging again, not around the pipe this time, but underneath it. If I couldn't make the opening bigger, maybe I could destabilize the pipe itself, create a crack that would give him just enough room to squeeze free. I dug with my fingernails until they bled, then kept digging with my fingertips. I dug until my hands were so numb I couldn't feel them anymore, until the cold concrete had worn away the skin on my knuckles. I dug like my life depended on it, because maybe it did. Every few minutes, I would stop and talk to him. I told him my name, told him about the streets above and the warm places I'd found to sleep over the years. I told him about the woman at the soup kitchen who always gave me extra bread, about the little girl who'd once smiled at me instead of looking away. I told him I wasn't going to leave him. His name came to me somewhere around hour 3. Bear. He looked like a bear with his thick coat and massive head. But more than that, he had the patient, enduring strength of something wild that had learned to survive against impossible odds. Bear and I were alike in ways that broke my heart. The digging was working slowly. I'd managed to loosen the soil around the base of the pipe, and when I pushed against it, I could feel it shift slightly. Just a fraction of an inch, but it was something. Bear seemed to sense the progress too. He'd grown more alert, lifting his head whenever the pipe moved, his tail making small, hopeful movements behind him in the narrow space. But the cold was getting worse. My hands were so stiff I could barely move my fingers, and Bear's breathing had grown even more labored. Ice was forming around the edges of the pipe, and I realized with growing horror that if the temperature dropped much more, he could freeze to death before I got him free. I tried pushing harder against the pipe, throwing my shoulder against the concrete with all my strength. On the third try, I heard something crack. Not the pipe, but something in my shoulder, a sharp pain that shot down my arm and made me cry out. Bear whined in response, trying to comfort me even in his own desperate situation. That's when I lost it. I pressed my forehead against the concrete and started to cry. Big, ugly sobs that echoed through the tunnel like the sound of something breaking. I cried for Bear, trapped and suffering in the dark. I cried for myself, useless and weak when someone needed me most. I cried for all the times I'd walked past someone else's pain because I had too much of my own to carry. I cried because for the first time in months, I cared about something more than my own survival, and I was failing. Bear must have heard something in my sobs that he recognized, because he started making a new sound, not whimpering or crying, but a low, gentle rumble deep in his chest. The sound a mother makes to comfort a frightened child. He was trying to comfort me. This dying animal, trapped and alone, was using what little strength he had left to make me feel better. I lifted my head and looked into his eyes, and I saw something there that I'd almost forgotten existed. Unconditional love. Pure, simple faith in the goodness of another soul. He believed in me. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and got back to work. By dawn, I had managed to create enough space around the pipe for it to shift almost 2 inches when I pushed against it. It wasn't much, but Bear was smaller now than when I'd found him, weakened by hours of struggle and stress. Maybe, if I could time it right, if I could coordinate our efforts. I explained the plan to him, talking in low, soothing tones. When I pushed against the pipe, he would need to pull himself backward with everything he had. It might hurt, might tear his skin against the rough concrete, but it was his only chance. He looked at me with those wise, trusting eyes and gave a small wag of his tail. We were going to do this together. I braced my shoulder against the pipe, feeling the sharp pain from my earlier injury shoot down my arm. Bear positioned his front paws against the inner walls of the tunnel, ready to push backward when the opening widened. On 3, I told him. 1, 2, 3. I threw every ounce of strength I had left against that pipe, ignoring the fire in my shoulder, ignoring the way my vision went white around the edges. I pushed like I was pushing against every door that had ever been slammed in my face, every opportunity I'd ever been denied, every moment of kindness the world had withheld. The pipe shifted, not much, but enough. Bear pulled himself backward with a strength I didn't know he still possessed, his claws scrabbling against the concrete. I heard his skin tear, heard him cry out in pain, but he kept pulling, and then, suddenly, miraculously, he was free. He tumbled out of the pipe and collapsed on the tunnel floor, his sides heaving with exhaustion. I fell beside him, my own strength completely spent, and for a long moment we just lay there breathing in the darkness. But we were both breathing. We were both alive. We had won. I managed to roll over and gather Bear into my arms, feeling the solid warmth of his body against my chest. He was hurt, bleeding from dozens of small cuts where the concrete had scraped his skin, but he was free. His tail was moving weakly against the floor, and when I buried my face in his matted fur, I could feel him trying to lick my ear. We stayed like that as the sun came up somewhere above us. Two broken souls holding each other in the darkness, both of us saved. Getting Bear out of the storm drain was almost as difficult as freeing him from the pipe. He was too weak to climb, and I was too exhausted to carry his full weight. But somehow, working together, we managed to boost him up through the great opening. I followed, dragging myself up onto the sidewalk like a man crawling out of his own grave. The world above looked different in the morning light. The Christmas decorations that had seemed mocking the night before now looked hopeful, celebratory. People were starting to emerge from their houses, children running to play in the fresh snow that had fallen while we worked underground. Bear stood beside me on unsteady legs, and I got my first good look at him in the daylight. He was magnificent, even injured and filthy. Even weakened by his ordeal, he carried himself with the dignity of a king. His coat, beneath the dirt and blood, was a rich brown and black. His eyes, now that they weren't filled with despair, were intelligent and kind. But he needed help. Medical attention, food, warmth. All things I couldn't provide. That's when I saw her. A woman in scrubs was walking toward us, probably heading to work at the hospital a few blocks away. She was young, maybe 30, with kind eyes and the sort of purposeful stride that spoke of someone who spent her days helping others. She stopped when she saw us, her gaze taking in my disheveled appearance and Bear's obvious injuries. For a moment, I expected her to cross the street, to avoid the homeless man and his stray dog like so many others had before. Instead, she walked straight toward us. "Are you both okay?" she asked, and there was genuine concern in her voice. Real worry for two strangers she had no reason to care about. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out in a jumbled rush. The storm drain, the pipe, the long night of digging. She listened patiently, never once looking at me like I was crazy or dangerous. When I finished, she knelt down beside Bear and gently examined his injuries with practiced hands. He let her touch him, seeming to sense that she meant no harm. "He needs a veterinarian," she said, "and you both need to get warm. Come with me." Her name was Dr. Sarah Chun, and she worked at the emergency room at Chicago General. She didn't hesitate to load us both into her car, didn't worry about the dirt or the smell, or what her colleagues might think when she showed up to work with a homeless man and an injured dog. She took us to a 24-hour veterinary clinic, where she somehow convinced them to treat Bear despite the fact that neither of us could pay. She sat with me in the waiting room while they cleaned his wounds and gave him 4 fluids, talking to me like I was a human being worthy of conversation. When was the last time someone had done that? Bear was going to be fine, the vet told us. Dehydrated, malnourished, and scraped up, but nothing that rest and care couldn't heal. He was a strong dog, probably only 3 or 4 years old. With proper treatment, he'd make a full recovery. But where would he go? I didn't have a home to take him to, no way to care for him properly. The thought of surrendering him to a shelter after everything we'd been through together felt like betrayal. But what choice did I have? Dr. Chun must have seen the conflict on my face. "I have a big backyard," she said quietly, "and my lease allows pets. If you're willing, both of you could stay with me until we figure something out." I stared at her, sure I'd misheard. A stranger, offering her home to a homeless man and a stray dog she'd just met? "Why?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at Bear sleeping peacefully on the examination table, his breathing steady and strong. "My father was homeless for 2 years when I was in college," she said finally. He was a veteran, struggled with PTSD and addiction. I used to wonder who was taking care of him when he was sleeping on the streets. I used to pray that someone, somewhere, was showing him kindness. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. Maybe this is my chance to be that someone. Bear lived with Dr. Chun for 3 months while he recovered fully from his injuries. But I stayed too, sleeping on her couch and helping around the house however I could. She helped me apply for disability benefits, connected me with counseling services, and never once made me feel like a burden. Slowly, carefully, I began to rebuild my life. Bear and I had saved each other in that storm drain. But Dr. Chun saved us both in a different way. She reminded us that the world still contained people who led with kindness, who saw suffering and moved toward it instead of away. Today, Bear is a registered therapy dog. We visit hospitals and nursing homes together, bringing comfort to people who are fighting their own battles with darkness. He has a way of sensing who needs him most, of laying his big head in just the right lap at just the right moment. I work part-time at the animal shelter now, helping other strays find their way home. Dr. Chun helped me get into a small apartment nearby, and Bear splits his time between both homes, loved and spoiled by everyone who meets him. But sometimes on cold winter nights, I still dream about that storm drain. I dream about the moment when I first heard his cry echoing up from the darkness, and the choice I almost didn't make to follow that sound into the unknown. What if I had kept walking that night? What if I had decided that someone else's pain wasn't my responsibility? I think about all the other cries for help that echo around us every day, in voices both human and animal. The sounds of suffering that we're so good at tuning out, at explaining away, at deciding aren't our problem to solve. Bear taught me that love isn't about having the right resources or the perfect circumstances. It's about seeing someone in need and deciding that their pain matters more than your own comfort. It's about crawling into dark places because someone down there needs to know they're not alone. That Christmas Eve, I thought I was saving a dog trapped in a frozen pipe. But really, Bear saved me. He saved me from becoming the kind of person who could walk past suffering without stopping. He saved me from a life where I only cared about my own survival. Now, every morning when I wake up and see him sleeping peacefully in a warm, safe place, I remember what miracles can happen when two broken souls refuse to give up on each other. The love we shared in that tunnel changed both of our lives forever. And maybe, just maybe, it's changing the lives of everyone we meet along the way. But let me tell you more about what happened in the months that followed, because Bear's story didn't end when we climbed out of that storm drain. In many ways, it was just beginning. Those first few days at Dr. Chen's house were like living in a dream. I kept expecting to wake up back on the streets, for this kindness to reveal itself as some cruel trick my mind was playing on me. But every morning, I would open my eyes on her soft couch, and Bear would be there beside me, his warm body pressed against my legs like an anchor to this new reality. Dr. Chun had rules, of course. I had to shower daily, help with household chores, and attend counseling sessions she arranged with a social worker who specialized in homeless veterans. She never asked about my past directly, never pushed for details about how I'd ended up on the streets, but she made it clear that staying with her meant committing to getting better. Bear became my motivation for everything. During those early weeks, while he was still recovering, I would sit beside his dog bed for hours, just watching him sleep. The veterinarian had warned us that some of his wounds might leave scars, that the trauma of being trapped might cause behavioral changes. But Bear seemed to take it all in stride, approaching each day with a resilience that humbled me. He never flinched when strangers approached, never showed aggression or fear, even toward the veterinary staff who had to perform painful procedures. It was as if his ordeal in the tunnel had somehow purified him, burned away everything except the essential goodness at his core. I started to understand why Dr. Chun had been so willing to help us. There was something about Bear that made people want to be better versions of themselves. When she came home from her long shifts at the hospital, exhausted and drained from dealing with human suffering all day, Bear would greet her at the door with such pure joy that you could literally see the stress melt from her shoulders. He had that effect on everyone. The mailman started bringing dog treats on his route. The elderly woman next door, Mrs. Patterson, began baking homemade dog biscuits every Sunday. Even Dr. Chen's teenage nephew, who had been sullen and withdrawn since his parents' divorce, would light up whenever Bear was around. Watching all of this, I began to understand that what had happened in that storm drain wasn't just about saving one animal. It was about awakening something in people, reminding them of their capacity for compassion. Bear was teaching us all how to love without conditions. The turning point came 6 weeks after the rescue, when Dr. Chun suggested we visit her hospital's pediatric ward. She'd been telling her colleagues about Bear's calm temperament and natural empathy, and several nurses had asked if he might be suitable for therapy work. I was terrified. The idea of walking into a hospital, of being around sick children while looking like someone who'd been living on the streets for years, felt overwhelming. What if the kids were scared of me? What if their parents complained? What if I somehow made things worse instead of better? But Bear seemed to sense my anxiety. The morning of our first visit, he pressed his nose against my hand and looked at me with those steady, trusting eyes. The same look he'd given me in the tunnel when he believed I could save him. He believed in me again. The pediatric ward was a place of controlled chaos. Brightly colored walls covered with cartoon characters couldn't quite mask the underlying atmosphere of worry and fear. Children in hospital gowns walked the halls with 4 poles, their parents following close behind with the hollow-eyed look of people who hadn't slept in days. Our first stop was the room of a 7-year-old boy named Tyler who'd been in the hospital for 3 weeks with leukemia. His mother, a woman about my daughter's age, sat beside his bed looking like she was holding herself together through sheer force of will. When we knocked on the door, Tyler's face was turned toward the wall. He didn't respond to our greeting, didn't seem interested in meeting the therapy dog everyone had been talking about. But Bear didn't need an invitation. He walked slowly into the room, his nails clicking softly on the linoleum floor, and sat down beside Tyler's bed. He didn't try to jump up or demand attention. He simply sat there, patient and calm, waiting. After several minutes, Tyler turned his head slightly, just enough to see Bear from the corner of his eye. Bear's tail moved once, a small wag that barely lifted off the floor. Tyler's hand crept over the edge of the bed, hanging down toward where Bear sat. Bear gently lifted his head and pressed his nose against the boy's palm. That's when Tyler started to cry. Not sad tears, but something deeper. Relief, maybe, or recognition. The tears of someone who had been carrying a terrible burden alone, and suddenly realized they didn't have to. His mother started crying too, and so did I. Tyler spent the next hour telling Bear everything. About how scared he was of the treatments, about the nightmares that kept him awake, about how he worried that his parents blamed themselves for his illness. Bear listened to every word, occasionally nuzzling Tyler's hand or resting his chin on the bed. When we finally left that room, Tyler was smiling for the first time in weeks, according to his nurse. His mother hugged me at the door. This stranger who looked nothing like the kind of person she would normally trust with her child. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing him exactly what he needed." But I hadn't brought Tyler anything. Bear had done that all on his own. Over the following months, Bear and I visited the hospital twice a week. We met children fighting cancer, elderly patients recovering from strokes, accident victims learning to walk again. Each person we encountered seemed to see something different in Bear, something they needed to help them heal. Some saw a loyal friend who would never leave their side. Others saw strength and resilience, Proof that it was possible to survive terrible things and still choose love. A few saw forgiveness, the kind of unconditional acceptance they'd been seeking their whole lives. But everyone who met Bear walked away changed. The transformation wasn't just happening to the patients, either. Working alongside Dr. Chen's colleagues, being trusted with something as precious as bringing comfort to sick children, I began to see myself differently too. For so long, I had defined myself by my failures. The job I'd lost, the marriage that had crumbled, the daughter who no longer returned my calls. I was the man who'd hit rock bottom and stayed there, who'd become invisible to the world above. But in the hospital, surrounded by people who were fighting battles that made my own struggles seem manageable, I started to understand that survival itself was a form of courage. That choosing to keep going day after day, even when everything seemed hopeless, was its own kind of heroism. Bear had been a hero in that tunnel, refusing to give up even when giving up would have been easier. But he'd also been a hero every day since, choosing to trust again, to love again, to believe that the world contained more kindness than cruelty. Maybe I could be that kind of hero too. The idea of becoming a certified therapy dog handler gave my days structure and purpose. I studied for the required tests, learned about animal behavior and proper handling techniques. Dr. Chun helped me navigate the paperwork and requirements, never making me feel like a charity case or a burden. Bear passed his certification tests with flying colors, of course. The evaluator, a stern woman who'd been working with therapy animals for 20 years, actually smiled when Bear demonstrated his ability to remain calm around medical equipment and loud noises. "This dog has the temperament of an angel," she told me afterward. "Whatever you've been through together, it's created something special." She had no idea how right she was. The certification opened new doors for us. We were invited to nursing homes, where elderly residents who hadn't spoken in months would suddenly come alive when Bear entered the room. We visited schools, where children learning about kindness and responsibility would practice reading aloud to Bear, who listened to every stumbling word with the patience of a saint. But it was our work with other homeless individuals that meant the most to me. Dr. Chun connected us with a local shelter that was piloting a program using therapy animals to help people transition off the streets. Many of the residents there struggled with depression, addiction, and trauma that made it difficult for them to trust social workers or counselors. But they trusted Bear. There was something about his calm presence, his obvious history of survival, that spoke to people who'd been written off by society. They could look at him and see proof that it was possible to emerge from darkness, to find safety and love after experiencing abandonment and pain. I would sit in group therapy sessions, Bear lying peacefully at my feet, and watch hardened men and women break down as they petted his soft fur. They would tell him things they'd never told another human being, secrets and fears and dreams they'd buried under layers of protective anger. Bear absorbed it all without judgment, offering nothing but his presence and the steady rhythm of his breathing. One evening, after a particularly difficult session with a young woman who'd been living in her car with her 2 children, I found myself thinking about my own daughter again. Emma would be 16 now, probably driving, maybe dating, certainly too busy with her own life to worry about where her father had ended up. I hadn't spoken to her in over 2 years, not since the last time I'd called drunk and desperate, begging for money and making promises I couldn't keep. Her stepfather had eventually gotten on the line and told me, in no uncertain terms, to stop calling. Maybe he'd been right to protect her from me. Maybe some bridges were too burned to rebuild. But holding Bear that night, feeling the steady beat of his heart against my chest, I wondered if redemption was really impossible. If Bear could trust again after being trapped and abandoned, if he could choose love after experiencing such profound fear and pain, maybe there was hope for relationships I thought I destroyed beyond repair. Dr. Chun found me crying on her couch that night, Bear's head in my lap, as I stroked his ears and whispered apologies to the darkness. What would it take? I asked her. To be someone my daughter could be proud of again? She sat down beside us, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. Maybe, she said gently, it starts with being proud of who you're becoming right now. The next morning, I wrote Emma a letter, not asking for anything, not making excuses for the past, just telling her about Bear and the work we were doing together. I told her about the children in the hospital who found comfort in his presence, about the elderly people who smiled for the first time in months when he entered their rooms. I told her that I was learning how to be the kind of person who ran towards suffering instead of away from it. How Bear had taught me that love meant showing up even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. I didn't expect a response. I mailed the letter more for my own healing than for any hope of reconciliation. But 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived at Dr. Chen's house with Emma's handwriting on it. Dad, she'd written, I've been wondering about you for so long. I'm proud of what you're doing with Bear. Maybe when I graduate this spring, I could come visit and meet him. I read that letter a dozen times before I could believe it was real. Bear seemed to sense my joy, wagging his tail and dancing around the living room like we were celebrating the greatest victory in the world. And maybe we were. The reunion with Emma happened 6 months later, on a warm Saturday in June. Dr. Chun had offered to host, and she decorated her backyard with balloons and flowers like it was the most important party of the year. I was more nervous than I'd been since the night in the storm drain. What if Emma was disappointed? What if I'd built this moment up too much in my mind? What if she took one look at me and realized that some people really couldn't change? But when her car pulled into the driveway, and I saw her step out looking so much like her mother at that age, so beautiful and confident and alive, all my fears melted away. Because Bear was beside me, calm and steady as always, reminding me that love didn't require perfection. It just required showing up. Emma knelt down to greet Bear first, which felt exactly right. He charmed her immediately, of course, pressing his nose into her hands and looking at her with those wise, gentle eyes that had saved so many hearts. He's beautiful, Dad, she said, and when she looked up at me, I saw forgiveness in her face. Not the kind that came from forgetting the past, but the kind that chose to believe in the possibility of a different future. We spent the afternoon in Dr. Chen's backyard, Bear serving as the perfect icebreaker whenever the conversation grew too heavy. Emma told me about school, about her plans for college, about the boy she was dating who played guitar and made her laugh. I told her about the hospital visits, about the elderly woman who'd started walking again after Bear spent an afternoon by her bedside, about the little boy who'd stopped having nightmares after Bear slept in his room for a week. She listened to every story with a kind of attention that told me she was seeing me as something more than the broken man who'd disappointed her so many times before. When the sun started to set, Emma asked if she could come with us on one of our hospital visits sometime. She was thinking about studying nursing, she said, and wanted to understand the kind of work that had changed me so much. Of course, I told her. Bear would love that. But what I meant was, I would love that. I would love the chance to show her who I was becoming, to let her see the man Bear had helped me remember I could be. As she drove away that evening, promising to call soon and visit again, I sat in the backyard with Bear and Dr. Chun, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. 2 years ago, I was dying in that storm drain, Dr. Chun said quietly. Not physically, maybe, but in every way that mattered. Bear saved you that night, but you saved him too. I thought about that as Bear settled his head in my lap, his breathing deep and content. Had I really saved him? Or had we simply saved each other, over and over again, in all the small moments that had followed that first desperate night? Every time I chose to get up and face another day instead of giving in to despair, I was saving him from losing the person who'd crawled into the darkness to find him. Every time he greeted a frightened child with patience and love, he was saving me from becoming someone who believed the world contained more cruelty than kindness. Every time we walked into a hospital room together, we were saving each other from the lie that our suffering had no purpose, that our broken places couldn't become sources of healing for others. The work we do together now has expanded beyond what I could have imagined. Bear has become something of a local celebrity, featured in newspaper articles about therapy animals and invited to speak at schools and community events. People want to hear the story of the homeless man and the trapped dog who found each other on Christmas Eve. But I always try to steer the conversation away from us and toward the hundreds of people we've had the privilege of meeting. The cancer patients who've taught us about courage, the elderly residents who've shown us the dignity of grace under pressure, the children who've reminded us that joy can coexist with pain. Each person we encounter adds something to our story, changes us in ways both subtle and profound. We're all connected, all part of the same web of suffering and healing, all capable of being someone else's answer to prayer. Bear understands this better than I do, I think. He doesn't see distinctions between the deserving and undeserving, between the clean and the dirty, between the successful and the forgotten. He sees souls in need of comfort, and he offers what he has without reservation. That's the lesson he's taught me, day after day, in hospital rooms and nursing homes and shelters across the city. Love isn't about having all the answers, or being perfect, or even being strong all the time. Love is about showing up. It's about sitting with someone in their darkness and reminding them they're not alone. It's about believing that every soul has value, that every story matters, that every small act of kindness ripples outward in ways we may never fully understand. Sometimes I think about that storm drain where our story began, about the desperate cries echoing through the darkness that almost no one heard. How many other cries are there, right now, in the tunnels and shadows of our world? How many souls are trapped and waiting for someone to care enough to crawl toward the sound of their pain? Bear and I can't save them all, but we can save the ones we're meant to find, the ones placed in our path by whatever force guides lost things toward each other. And maybe that's enough. Maybe being willing to descend into dark places for the sake of love is its own form of salvation, its own kind of miracle. The love we shared in that tunnel changed both of our lives forever. And maybe, just maybe, it's changing the lives of everyone we meet along the way. Sometimes salvation comes in the form of a desperate cry from the darkness, asking us to be brave enough to crawl toward the sound instead of walking away. Sometimes it comes with 4 paws and a tail that wags against all odds. And sometimes it comes disguised as the very thing we thought we were trying to save. There's something else I need to tell you about Bear. Something that didn't become clear until months after our rescue. Something that changed how I understood everything that had happened that Christmas Eve. It was Dr. Chun who first noticed it, during one of our regular visits to the hospital. We were in the children's ward, and Bear was working with a little girl named Sophie who'd been in a car accident. She'd been silent for weeks, traumatized into a kind of emotional hibernation that worried her doctors and broke her parents' hearts. Bear had been sitting beside her bed for almost an hour, just being present while she stared at the ceiling with vacant eyes. I was starting to think we should move on to another patient when something extraordinary happened. Sophie reached out and touched Bear's ear, running her small fingers through his fur. But instead of the usual gentle response he gave to children, Bear began to shake. Not from fear or cold, but from some deep, cellular memory that seemed to be triggered by her touch. Dr. Chen noticed it too. She watched with professional curiosity as Bear's breathing became labored, as his eyes took on that same distant look Sophie had been carrying for weeks. "He's remembering something," she whispered to me. "Something about being trapped." That's when Sophie spoke for the first time since the accident. "You were scared too, weren't you?" she said to Bear, her voice barely audible. You were stuck and nobody could hear you crying. Bear stopped shaking and looked directly into her eyes. The connection between them was instant, electric, like two souls recognizing each other across an impossible distance. Sophie started crying then, but they were healing tears. All the fear and trauma she'd been holding inside came pouring out as she buried her face in Bear's thick fur. He held perfectly still, absorbing her pain like he'd done for so many others. But this time was different. This time, he was healing too. Dr. Chun explained it to me later, in the quiet of her car as we drove home. Sometimes, she said, trauma survivors recognize each other in ways that go beyond words or conscious understanding. Bear and Sophie had both experienced being trapped, helpless, convinced they were going to die alone. Their healing was intertwined now, each one's recovery strengthening the others. Over the following weeks, Sophie's progress was remarkable. Every visit from Bear brought new breakthroughs, new words, new smiles. But I noticed that Bear was changing too. The deep sadness that had always lingered behind his eyes, a shadow from his time in that concrete pipe, was finally beginning to lift. He was learning that he wasn't the only one who had survived the darkness. This realization led to a new chapter in our work together. Dr. Chun connected us with a trauma counselor who specialized in animal-assisted therapy for survivors of abuse, accidents, and violence. The counselor, Dr. Williams, was immediately interested in Bear's unique combination of empathy and personal experience with trauma. We started attending group sessions for people dealing with post-traumatic stress, veterans, domestic violence survivors, accident victims, people who'd lost loved ones in sudden, violent ways. The demographic was diverse, but they all shared one thing in common. They'd all been trapped in dark places, whether physical or emotional. Bear had an almost supernatural ability to identify who needed him most in these sessions. He would walk slowly around the circle of chairs, sniffing gently at hands and knees, before settling down beside someone who looked completely unremarkable to me. Invariably, that person would be the one most ready for a breakthrough. There was Marcus, a veteran who'd been struggling with survivor's guilt after losing his entire unit in an IED explosion. He'd been coming to group therapy for 6 months without speaking a single word. But when Bear laid his head on Marcus's boots and looked up at him with those knowing eyes, the floodgates opened. "I couldn't save them," Marcus whispered, his hands shaking as he stroked Bear's ears. "I was supposed to protect them, and I couldn't save them." Bear whined softly, pressing closer against Marcus's legs. In that moment, they were no longer man and dog, but two souls who understood what it meant to be helpless while others suffered. The breakthrough was profound. Marcus began talking about his experiences, about the guilt and shame he'd been carrying alone for years. But more importantly, he began to understand that survival didn't require explanation or justification. Sometimes, the most heroic thing you can do is simply keep breathing. Bear was teaching him what he'd taught me in that storm drain. That being saved doesn't diminish your worth, and that accepting help isn't a sign of weakness. There was Maria, a mother whose child had been killed by a drunk driver. She'd been attending therapy sessions mechanically, going through the motions of grief counseling without truly engaging. Her therapist was worried that she was stuck in the early stages of grief, unable to move forward. But when Bear approached her during one session, something in his gentle persistence broke through her protective numbness. She started talking to him in Spanish, the language of her childhood, telling him about her daughter's favorite foods, her laugh, the way she'd love to dance in the kitchen while Maria cooked dinner. Bear listened to every word, his head tilted slightly as if he understood not just the emotions behind the words, but the words themselves. When Maria finished talking, she was sobbing, but they were the first tears she'd shed since the accident. That was the beginning of her real healing. Each person we worked with taught Bear something new about resilience, about the different ways trauma could manifest, and the various paths to healing. But they also taught me something profound about the nature of rescue itself. I'd always thought of that Christmas Eve as the night I saved Bear. But watching him work with trauma survivors, seeing the way he intuitively understood their pain and knew exactly how to offer comfort, I began to realize that maybe the story was more complicated than that. Maybe Bear had been meant to go through that ordeal in the pipe. Maybe his suffering had a purpose that went far beyond our individual story of rescue and recovery. This wasn't a comforting thought at first. The idea that a loving universe would allow an innocent animal to suffer for some greater purpose seemed cruel and arbitrary. But as I watched Bear transform the lives of person after person, as I saw him give meaning to their pain by understanding it so completely, I started to see it differently. Maybe trauma wasn't just something to survive and overcome. Maybe it could be transformed into a tool for healing others, a bridge of understanding that connected wounded souls across the darkness. Bear had become that bridge. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my own story followed the same pattern. My years on the streets, my experience of abandonment and despair, hadn't been erased by my rescue. They'd been transformed into something that allowed me to connect with other homeless individuals in ways that social workers and counselors, no matter how well-meaning, sometimes couldn't. When I walked into a shelter or sat in a group therapy session with people who'd lost everything, they didn't see a reformed addict or a success story. They saw someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be invisible, to be written off by society, to wonder if anyone would miss you if you simply disappeared. That understanding was my gift to them, the treasure I'd found in the darkest period of my life. Bear and I had both learned to alchemize our suffering into gold. The program we developed with Dr. Williams became a model for other trauma treatment centers. We were invited to conferences, asked to speak at universities, featured in medical journals. But the work itself remained intensely personal, one connection at a time, one broken heart carefully tended back to wholeness. Every person we worked with left their mark on us. Bear's coat became a tapestry of scents and memories from all the hands that had touched him, all the tears that had been shed into his fur, all the whispered secrets and desperate prayers he'd absorbed. I kept a journal of our encounters, partly for research purposes, but mostly because I didn't want to forget anyone we'd helped. Their names and stories filled notebook after notebook. Sarah, who'd survived a house fire but lost her daughter. James, who'd been paralyzed in a diving accident. Elena, who'd escaped an abusive marriage with her children and was learning to trust again. Each entry was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but also to Bear's extraordinary gift for meeting people exactly where they were in their healing journey. The 5th anniversary of our rescue fell on a snowy December evening, much like the night we'd first found each other. Dr. Chun had organized a small celebration at her house, inviting some of the people whose lives Bear had touched over the years. Tyler, the little boy from the pediatric ward, was there with his mother. He was 12 now, cancer-free for 3 years, and he'd grown taller than Bear's back. But when he saw his old friend, he dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around Bear's neck, just like he had as a frightened 7-year-old. Sophie was there too, vibrant and talkative, pursuing her dream of becoming a veterinarian so she could help animals the way Bear had helped her. Marcus had brought his new service dog, a young lab mix he was training with techniques he'd learned from watching Bear work. Maria came with photos of the scholarship she'd established in her daughter's name, providing therapy animals to families grieving the loss of children. She credited Bear with showing her how to transform her pain into purpose. As I looked around the room at all these faces, all these lives that had been touched and changed by a dog who'd once been trapped and dying in a concrete pipe, I felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had grown from that one moment of deciding to follow a cry for help into the darkness. Dr. Chun raised a glass of sparkling cider for a toast. To Bear, she said, who taught us all that sometimes being broken is just another way of letting the light in. Everyone raised their glasses, but I noticed that most of them were looking at Bear rather than drinking. He was lying in the center of the room, surrounded by all these people who loved him, his tail thumping slowly against the carpet. In that moment, I understood something that had taken me 5 years to fully grasp. Bear wasn't just a therapy dog who happened to have survived trauma. He was a living embodiment of the truth that our wounds, when properly tended, become our greatest sources of wisdom and compassion. His ability to heal others didn't come despite his suffering, but because of it. He had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to him and transformed it into the best thing he could offer the world. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and Bear and I were settling in for the night, I found myself thinking about all the other animals out there who might be suffering right now. Trapped in pipes, abandoned in shelters, struggling to survive on the streets. How many of them were meant to become healers like Bear? How many future therapy dogs and service animals and emotional support companions were waiting for someone to hear their cries and decide to act? The thought was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Heartbreaking because suffering was still happening, right now, to innocent creatures who'd done nothing to deserve it. Hopeful because every rescue was potentially the beginning of countless other rescues. Every saved life a seed that could grow into a forest of healing. Bear lifted his head and looked at me, as if he'd been following my thoughts. His eyes held that same calm wisdom they'd carried since our first night together. But now I could see something else there too. Gratitude. Not just for being saved, but for being able to save others in return. We'd come full circle, from rescue to rescuer, from broken to healer, from lost to found, and back to finding others. And in the morning, we'd wake up and do it all again. Sometimes salvation comes in the form of a desperate cry from the darkness, asking us to be brave enough to crawl toward the sound instead of walking away. Sometimes it comes with 4 paws and a tail that wags against all odds. And sometimes it comes disguised as the very thing we thought we were trying to save. But the most beautiful truth I've learned is this: salvation is never a one-time event. It's a daily choice, a continuous cycle of healing and being healed, of saving and being saved, of finding light in dark places and learning to carry that light to others who are still lost in the shadows. Bear taught me that the greatest rescue stories are the ones that never really end, because each person saved becomes capable of saving others. Each heart healed becomes capable of healing other hearts. Each life transformed becomes a beacon of hope for lives still waiting to be transformed. That Christmas Eve, I thought I was saving one dog from a frozen pipe. But really, I was joining an endless chain of rescue and redemption that stretches backward and forward through time, connecting every broken soul that has ever chosen love over fear, hope over despair, action over indifference. Bear and I are just 2 links in that chain, but we're proud to be exactly where we belong.